pause it just for a second. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Tuesday. We will give people a few more minutes to come in. We had about 150 people registered for this. So we hopefully will have about 30, maybe even up to close to 50 that will join us this afternoon. We will be recording this panel to make it available for those that registered, and we'll see if there's other means by which we can distribute this. So if you're unable to, or if you have, especially if you had a colleague that's unable to join, we'll do our best to make sure that is distributed to them. Just a few little housekeeping notes before we begin. We do not have this in the webinar format of Zoom. This is just a regular Zoom meeting. So we do ask that you please mute your microphones through the course of today's session. It is up to you whether you want your video on or not. I've always find it a little less distracting if the video is on and only the presenters have their video, but we'll leave that to you. But the main ask is that you please do keep your microphone muted. Also, during the presentation, if you have a question, please put that in the chat. We will do our best to answer that as we go through the panel session today. So with that, we'll give one more minute. And for those you don't know, this is, and for those you say, what did I join up for this afternoon? It's right there on your screen. It's the Advocacy Panel Webinar by TESOL International Association, focused upon United States federal actions and the implications for English learners with disabilities. So we got an excellent panel with us today for this presentation. So we'll wait just to we'll give one more minute, and then we will start in earnest. I'll have the recording going. But just a reminder, and while you're at it, please feel free to put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. We'd be happy to hear from you. Please feel free to do that. So, okay. All right. Well, Kuna, Jill, if you're ready, I'll go ahead and start. I think well, I've got some others here. We'll continue to add people hopefully as we go along, and we'll hopefully get those numbers up. I do realize it is a 5 o'clock on a Tuesday, at least here on the East Coast. And which means it's what 2 o'clock? Yeah, 2 o'clock on the West Coast. So hopefully we'll have people joining from across, well, not just across the U.S., but it'd be great to have people internationally, or at least outside the U.S. too, join in. I think this is a pertinent topic for all. All right. Well, again, good afternoon. My name is Jeff Hutchison. I am the Director of Advocacy and Public Policy for TESOL International Association. I have the privilege and honor, if I may go so far as that, of hosting this panel this afternoon, bringing together both those members of TESOL working with our interest sections here for supporting students with disabilities, as well as external with our peer associations for the Council for Exceptional Children. So we are joined today. I'll start with Kuna Tavalin, who's a Senior Policy and Advocacy Advisor for the Council for Exceptional Children, as well as Jill Hackeman. Did I pronounce it right, Jill? Okay, all right, good. I always have a little trouble with that, Jill. My apologies. But Jill is the chair of our interest section supporting children with disabilities at TESOL International Association. If you are a member, or if you are not a member, we'd love for you to join. We'll have a little bit of information about that towards the end, as well as some opportunities for you to take action, as this is a policy update. There's always opportunity for you to exercise your constitutional right to petition the government with your grievances. I'm not saying that you would necessarily have any grievances now, but if you do, there is that constitutional right to do so. And we'll have a couple of different ways in which you can exercise that right, make it easy for you as we go along. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. And Kuna, I will turn this over to you, and we'll go ahead and get started. Let me make sure I am recording. I do want this. Am I recording?
Looks like you are to me.
I am recording. I think I am recording. Okay. Yes, I am recording. Perfect. Too many buttons. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you, Jeff. As Jeff mentioned, my name's Kuna and I'm with the Council for Exceptional Children. So just for folks who are not familiar with the organization, we're 36,000 members strong, and we represent the full kind of spectrum of special educators um, from pre-service teachers all the way through doctoral educators in higher ed, from early interventionists through transition specialists in our IDEA implementation space, specialized instructional support personnel, paraeducators. Really, if you are touching any part of IDEA, we try to represent you. So that is the organization. Jill is a member of both TESOL and CEC, and so she's really our kind of bridge between the two worlds, which, as any educator knows, are not actually disconnected and really need professionals to be well informed on the needs of English learners as well as the needs of people with disabilities, because there is a lot of intersectionality. So I'm going to start by giving, I'm a government affairs professional. So I'm going to talk about what's happening in DC right now, and really with a focus on special education, but with some additional kind of details. And then Jill's going to wrap it all up in a nice bow and make it all make sense for us. No pressure. So right now we're in kind of a confusing moment where we're talking about three budgets at the same time, and they're really kind of separate pieces of processes and not necessarily related. So and it's confusing. I just, I've even heard professionals and news broadcasters confuse these recently. So I'm going to try and keep this as simple as possible and walk through what's going on. The first is that we're in the middle of the annual appropriations process. So just to ground you in what that means, the appropriations, the actual money that goes out for any given law to fund that law. So here on this slide, I have a comparison chart between what an authorization is versus an appropriation. So the authorization is the law itself. So the Every Student Succeeds Act is an authorized law. Title III is not funded under that law unless the appropriators decide to give it money in a given year. So that's kind of the very basic difference. Most members of Congress write laws, and a few fund them. So there's really very distilled power in that power of the purse. These are discretionary funding funds. Appropriations are discretionary funds. So this doesn't count the majority or the bulk of the federal budget, which is the entitlement programs, our national debt, and so on. This is really just kind of the way that we fund the federal agencies and the programs under their purview. So when I talk about appropriations in this context, it's really about the money that goes to the Department of Education to carry out the laws that are education related. So the first kind of symbolic step in the annual budget and appropriations process that Congress is in charge of is the delivery of the president's budget to Congress. And so just to give a little bit of a level set on what the president's budget actually is, it's an annual document submitted to Congress that provides proposed funding levels for each of the federal programs in each of the agencies that are discretionary. So again, we're not talking about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or the national debt, but we are talking about almost every other program. So, and just to give a little bit of a sense of like scope, education accounts for less than 2% of the budget. So the president's budget also kind of puts forward their vision. Usually it's a budget that has 10-year forecasts, priorities, visions that may not be status quo, but may kind of shake things up a bit. But they're all proposals. And in almost any year when the president submits his budget, Congress immediately says like, that's nice, but you don't have the power of the purse. We do. We get to make these decisions, really underscoring that the budget itself is a non-binding proposal, and it is Congress that writes the actual spending bills. So while we do kind of focus a little bit of advocacy on the administration and on making sure that programs are in the budget proposal, we spend as advocates the bulk of our time talking with Congress about how to actually write those bills. But like I said, the president's budget typically is the starting point for Congress's budget and appropriations process, which is an annual cycle. So what's in this year's president's budget proposal? So we are currently in fiscal year 2025, but we are looking toward fiscal year 2026, which will start on October 1st. So we're focusing our efforts right now, most of them, on fiscal year 2026. So the president's budget proposal is for that year. And just kind of a quick overview, what it does is it cuts the Department of Education by about $12.5 billion, or 15, almost 16%. For next year. And when I say it cuts, I say what I mean is it proposes a cut. Again, this is not actually happening. This is a proposal. It maintains Title I Part A at current funding levels, which are actually last year's funding levels. And I'm not going to get too far into that, but Congress didn't actually write spending bills for fiscal year 2025. They just kind of said, do what we did last year. And they didn't do a good job of writing those bills. And so I think maybe accidentally or on purpose, they wrote in a lot of flexibility that it has become problematic, but I'm not going to get into that. Jeff, if you want to get into that, it's all you. But so
I'll quickly
yeah.
just interject, because I want people to know that at the end we're going to have actually a little call to action. There's going to be several calls to action at the end, and one of them will be around that continuing resolution for fiscal year 25. That discretion was supposed to be addressed in a 45-day period after that passage, and to date, at least for education, programs out of ESSA. There's, I think, 6 programs that have not been allocated funding. Title 1A has been, but I think you have it on there. You know, the migrant education, Title 1C, has not been allocated. Title 3, English language acquisition, has not been allocated yet. And, you know, schools' budgets begin next week. And so it's one of the big questions. What are schools doing when they have an assumption that they'll be receiving this level of funding, but it's not been allocated yet? So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but that's I don't want to go too deep at this point with that.
So I'll just kind of summarize that as all of our programs are currently operating at last year's funding levels, but with some asterisks and some additional details, because it proved more complicated than I think was initially anticipated. So if you're getting level funded, you're actually being level funded at fiscal year 24 levels, not 25, because they're the same, right? So, and we all know that over time, level funding is a cut because of inflation and whatnot, the price of eggs. So,
And some of these programs are level funded since 2023. So
yeah, that's true. So this budget proposal would take 18 of the K-12 programs, discretionary grant programs, really, most of them, and just fold them into a new formula grant, with the rationale that it will provide states with more flexibility, and they won't have to tie the funding they receive to a specific activity. But it also cuts the funding, the overall funding for that K-12 pot by a significant amount of money. So states will be receiving less funding to do the activities of their choice, but certainly it will be limiting the amount of activities they can do. Special programs for migrant students, migrant education, English language acquisition, which is Title III. Those programs are eliminated. They're not rolled into this consolidated fund. They are just eliminated for various reasons. There's some language in the budget about spending money on undocumented people rather than American school children. There's some money about waste or inefficiencies. There's different rationales for different programs, but the language is pretty critical of each of these programs. It also eliminates all funding for teacher and school leader preparation and development. Jeff and I were talking earlier about the Teaching Quality Partnership Program, TQP. We saw a lot of these programs be kind of preemptively eliminated through the cancellation of grants this spring, and the budget proposal does not restore funding for those programs. When it comes to IDEA, the budget, sorry, I just saw a question in the chat. I'm not very good at monitoring chat, but if folks do have questions, feel free to raise your hand and we can interact. But the question was, what are some of those 18 programs? Right here, that are existing K-12 programs. Those programs, a lot of them are discretionary grant programs. Just let me trying to think off the top. So
Yeah, Kuna, I don't, if I can help a little bit, I don't
yeah.
think that all of them have been articulated. At
They
least
are articulated in the budget. Some of them are just eliminated and some are rolled into this. So
yeah.
community schools, for example, rolled into this. Statewide Family Engagement Centers, the Javits Gifted and Talented Program. I have to think to kind of start listing all of them one by one, but it's a lot of competitive grant programs. And then there are others like the ones that serve English learners that are just eliminated and not rolled in. The educator prep programs are not rolled into that, they're eliminated. So it depends on the grant program. When it comes to IDEA, there's a similar style of proposal, which is so Title I, Part A of ESCA is restored, maintained. The same with the grants to states program under IDEA. But there are a lot of other smaller parts of IDEA. About 4% of the IDEA annual budget is the preschool grants and IDEA national activities, which range from personnel preparation and development to technical assistance centers, parent centers. Those are all zeroed out. And that money is moved into the grants to states program with the rationale that it will provide states the flexibility to use those monies how they want, to prioritize them how they want. But the challenge under IDEA is that would require legislative language to amend IDEA. And typically you don't legislate in an appropriations bill. Appropriators and legislators are very territorial about their domains, and so neither tries to do the other's job. And so it does require legislative an amendment to IDEA. And so it provides an additional challenge. The proposal maintains the IDEA Part C program, which is for infants and families, but it eliminates the special education research branch of IES. So overall, the hit to special education, I think, is smaller in terms of dollars than other programs in the budget proposal. However, it really kind of takes an axe to the IDEA infrastructure and hands all of the decision making over to states who most of which are not equipped to do things like stand up a parent center or compete grants to institutions of higher education and local education agencies to do high quality personnel preparation, do a needs assessment statewide, like those kinds of things that happen at the national level. because they provide efficiency, create technical assistance centers on a given specified topic within special ed. Those are the kinds of parts of the IDEA law that actually create efficiencies and allow for a little bit of money to be spent really efficiently. So that's the budget, but this is the budget and appropriations process. And this is where we are right now, which is we've received the president's budget, and Congress has taken input from stakeholders, and they are now in the bill writing process. The House writes and marks up, which literally means like amend, like with a red pen, marks up their bills first, and the Senate goes second. And the House this week has been doing just that, marking up bills, going through extensive amendment processes. It looks like the bill that funds education will be considered, drafted, marked up at the end of July. So we've got a little bit of time still. And the Senate has not put forward a timeline for when they're going to be writing their bills. So both bodies of Congress will read the president's budget. They'll become familiar with it. They will decide whether they want to follow any given part of that budget. So this is really a key moment for stakeholders to weigh in. So the next steps, right? I've just said, I've kind of gone over all of this, but I just want to highlight one key element, which is that in the House, the appropriations bills can be passed by a simple majority. So the House bills tend to be partisan regardless of who's in control, who holds the gavel. That's how they go. The Senate has to deliberate. They need to have 60 votes to pass any spending bills, any of these appropriations bills, which means they have to work across the aisle regardless of who's in charge. And what we've seen is some pretty measured, negotiated bills coming out of the Senate and very partisan bills coming out of the House. And then the two bodies need to meet and figure out how to meet in the middle somewhere, right? And what that looks like. And that's really the part of the process that causes all of the challenges. That is why we ended up in the situation we were in this year, where fiscal year 2025 wasn't finalized until March, which is more than halfway through the fiscal year, because they just couldn't shake free any of the disagreements on what to cut, what to fund, etc. Right now, the House dynamic is that they would like to see significant cuts to discretionary funding. And they're more likely to really follow the president's budget proposal, maybe not exactly, but the gist of it, the flavor. And in the Senate, they know they have to work across the aisle, so they can't pass a bill that has big cuts or big policy priorities that only mirror one side. So that's where we are. We're really fast approaching the deadline for having to make a decision on fiscal year 2026. There are 99 days until the end of the fiscal year. And without any kind of action, we do see a government shutdown. So it's going to be, I don't know, it's going to be probably a pretty tense September this year. I'm going to pivot though, because I've just talked about the president's budget and the budget and appropriations process, and there's one more budget that's going on right now. I'm going to try and keep this really quick because I know I'm starting to run low on time, but there's another process happening at the same time that is not related to the budget or the appropriations process, which is called budget reconciliation. This is a kind of a budget gimmick that only really works if you have the same party in control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, because it's a once a fiscal year opportunity to write a budget bill that only needs a simple majority in the Senate. So you bypass that 60 vote threshold in the Senate. However, it can only increase or decrease the deficit. So you can't just write sweeping policy changes into a budget reconciliation bill. And so some recent examples, the Affordable Care Act, which that seems like big sweeping policy, but the details of the Affordable Care Act really are upping and increasing and decreasing spending and taxation. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act which is, some folks call it the Trump tax cuts. This is the bill that expires at the end of this year. This law expires at the end of the year, and this is kind of the bill that is the catalyst for the urgency to get this particular budget reconciliation bill across the finish line, because it would extend those tax cuts or make them permanent. And folks really don't want to see a regression to the pre-2017 tax law on the Republican side. The American Rescue Plan Act was another budget reconciliation bill, so just another example. There aren't that many. But just to clarify, this is not part of the budget process or the annual appropriations process. This is really kind of a rare bite at the apple when there's a trifecta and the stars align. So the current bill that's being debated is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Like I said, it extends the 2017 tax cuts, but it also does a lot of other things. It puts a lot more money into Homeland Security. It also establishes a national voucher program for K-12 education. And it also has a series of restrictions on student borrowing in higher education. And then there are significant cuts to Medicaid. There are some restrictions on or penalties for states who provide Medicaid to non-citizens, undocumented people. Those provisions, they're all being scrutinized right now by the Senate parliamentarian over the question of whether they are actually budget provisions or legislative provisions. And a lot of the contents of the House bill are being stripped out in the Senate because they don't meet that threshold. The Senate is where those questions get scrutinized. And right now the Senate is scrambling to rewrite and arguing in front of the parliamentarian their cases for keeping or stripping certain provisions. It's really dynamic. It's possible that this bill will be taken up later this week. It's actually quite probable. And so this is that other budget reconciliation piece that I just want folks to be aware of. Jeff, are there pieces of this bill that you want to elevate?
No, there's nothing that we have focused in on this because our focus on advocacy is for the ELT profession. It's for the multilingual learners of English, and since most of that it falls into the discretionary on the appropriation side, this has not been an area of focus. However, we have participated in joint advocacy with some of our peer associations because this does have an impact, especially. At least how the version that came out of the House. We'll see what comes out of the Senate, but the version that came out of the House will have impact for access to public services for some immigrants that are lawfully present. And it also has some steep fee increase. Well, how do you increase zero? Well, steep fee increases for asylum applications and the work authorizations, et cetera. So it is adjacent. It impacts the community, but it's not one that we have not put out calls to action. We have been in the background working with some advocacy associations and efforts there, but that's really where we've kind of fallen in on this. Our focus right now is on that first part that you had on the appropriations on the discretionary spending.
Thank you. And I do see one more question in the chat box about whether the budget proposal impacts family literacy. Oops. And I will say that it does propose to eliminate adult education. The Adult Ed and Family Literacy Act funds right.
Yeah.
Leave it at that.
Yeah, and Robert, just to jump in, we'll have one of the calls to action will be about fiscal year 25 because not only does the president propose elimination of AFLA funding or adult education funding for 2026, they currently are on a stall for what's called the Integrated English Language Civics Education, which is primarily for English learners and their integration into the workforce and communities. Hence the civics part as well. And that has not been allocated to the states. And it's It's a little troubling right now. If you're a state director of adult ed, a lot of questions right now about what you're doing for that. And to give you some sense, 16% of the adult participants in all of the adult AFLA funded programs are actually in the IELCE programs. So it's a significant portion there. I'm sorry, Kuna, please go ahead. I just
No, no problem. There's a lot of really big questions that I still need to get to in a very short amount of time. And one of them is the Department of Education closing. There was an executive order to close the Department of Education, but there was a word in there that I think is important, which is that the Department of Education, the secretary must do everything lawful to close the department. Right now, a lot of the actions that the department has taken are actually caught up in lawsuits. And lawfully, the secretary cannot close the Department of Education. It requires an act of Congress. So there are some bills that have started to propose closing the department, but it doesn't look like that's a thing that, well, who knows? But it seems not to be the top priority at the moment. Some of these bills, I think, are a little bit more detailed than others. But we would really be monitoring the Education Committee chairman in the House and Senate to see what kind of a proposal they put forward. So the short answer to the question is the Department of Education is not closed. However, there was a really significant reduction in force, which is our inside the Beltway lingo for firing a lot of people. About half of the department staff was fired in March. And in February and March, actually. There are a lot of significant impacts. 7 of the 12 Office for Civil Rights field offices were closed. Those field offices receive complaints of civil rights violations, and then they handle them. There was already a backlog, so significantly cutting that workforce, I think logically would result in an increase in the backlogs. The Institute for Education Sciences staff was cut back really significant. I don't think we have an official tally, but it sounds like it went from hundreds to tens, like really significant cutback. And then all of the different offices within the Department of Education, their legal and policy staff were cut, which just really leaves a void in, legal analysis, technical assistance, and even just, ensuring that there are folks at the department who can provide effective oversight, legal oversight of the federal education laws. There are a lot of other executive orders. I don't need to tick through all of them, but what I will say is that they're all kind of guiding the agencies on whether to eliminate existing contracts and grants, and also moving forward how to prioritize. And I'm sure that you all are well aware of many of them. The I already went over this basically, but I think folks know the teacher quality partnerships, SEED, and teacher and school leader grants were terminated in large swaths over the spring. Over $900 million in IES contracts were terminated. And it sounds like every single grant at the department has been or will be reviewed and scrutinized. So really to ensure that there isn't any contradiction between executive orders and the funding that is being supported by the Department of Education. We don't really have a good idea of what the future looks like other than we can apply what we've seen and make logical kind of assumptions about what we may see in the future. And the final thing is that the Department of Education just closed a comment period, and I know TESOL has weighed in, CEC has already as well, on the secretary's priorities. And those typically pertain to competitive grant programs, and they can be absolute or are, like preferred priorities. And the three that the secretary is focusing on are evidence-based literacy, school choice, and prioritizing funding to states. So that is kind of the very quick cliff notes of the Department of Education. And I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand it over to, there we go, to Jill to talk a little bit more about how these federal laws do impact the intersection of students with disabilities and English learners.
Thank you, Kuna. Screen. So I'm, as Kuna said, going to share some of the intersections between multilingual learners of English and special education. We as educators know that kids hold multiple identities and multiple labels sometimes, and that none of these systems within education are separate, but they are often separate in schools, districts, and states. So I am, again, Jill Hakimian. I am a senior project associate at the NYU Metro Center, and I'm the chair of the Supporting Students with Disabilities Interest Section in TESOL International, and a member of the Division for Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Exceptional Learners of CEC. So Kuna mentioned a number of things about IDEA. It is still a law. The appropriation process for funding is what is kind of up in the air right now. In terms of multilingual learners, IDEA sets provisions for assessment and evaluation requirements for special education evaluation, including that assessments must not be racially or culturally discriminatory, and that they should be provided in the home language of the child. It also sets the rights of parents and guardians to interpretation. For students with disabilities, IDEA lays out the rules around free and appropriate public education for all students, the least restrictive environment where students should be educated alongside their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent possible, and also defines the disability categories. So there's a number of different intersections between multilingual learners and special education that I'm going to talk through quickly. The first is translation and interpretation. Parents and guardians have a right to interpretation and translation, and it is the school's responsibility to provide it. Interpreters cannot be students. Students should not be translating for parents. And interpreters not only need to speak the language, but they need to have the appropriate background and preparation to be able to discuss the concepts and terms that are being talked about. And this applies to all families, not just multilingual learners. So we often have students with disabilities who may be proficient in English, but their families are not. And those families also have these rights to translation and interpretation. A joint memo was released in 2015 from the U.S. Department of Education and the Department of Justice around limited English proficient parents and guardians. And it sets out a number of things, including but not limited to registration, report cards, student discipline policies, and special education services that need to be communicated in the language of the family. There's also disproportionate identification of multilingual learners of English for special education, and they are also disproportionately classified into specific disability classifications. This is due to confusion between common indicators of disability and the stages of second language acquisition, invalid or inappropriate assessments, and some pervasive myths that we'll talk about in a few minutes about referring multilingual learners to special education. And this is where those cuts that Kuna just talked about to personnel preparation for teachers and leaders are so key here. because we know that this has been an ongoing issue for many years, and cutting preparation is not going to make it better. You can see here that multilingual learners of English are more likely than all students with disabilities to be classified into specific learning disability or speech and language impairment, and are less likely to be classified into categories such as other health impairment or autism. So you mentioned earlier, IDEA sets out the rules around least restrictive environment. There are also rules from the TESOL side on multilingual learners and avoiding segregation. So multilingual learners with disabilities who are under both categories are more likely to miss class time due to pull-out services. They are also more likely to be placed into restrictive and segregated settings. Students should be placed based on their individual needs, not where there's a seat in the classroom or what's most convenient for staff. And there are regulations and policies regarding both populations. So here you can see quoted from the IDEA regulations: to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are to be educated with children who are non-disabled. And then on the English learner side, we have that EL programs may not unjustifiably segregate students, and that if EL students receive separate instruction, it should be for a limited time. And I also want to point out that the enforcement of these policies falls on the Office of Civil Rights, which, as Kuna just mentioned, has been largely reduced. So not only, do we have these laws and we're thinking about what the funding is going to look like, but it's also about accountability and enforcement that is being cut. Provision of services is another issue for dually identified students who are both multilingual learners and students with disabilities. They have a right to services under both classifications. I often hear schools talking about how you have to choose one, or one is more important than the other, but there are laws and policies for both, and students have the right to both services. And implementing that does require time and scheduling, and again, personnel and training in order to meet the needs of those students. Outcomes for students with disabilities and English learners are much worse than for the average students. And so when we talk about dually identified students, they are even worse. For the school year 2019 to 2020, the graduation rate of all students with disabilities was about 77%. And for dually identified students, it was 71%. And the dropout rate for dually identified students is several percentage points higher than for all students with disabilities. And you see here, students with disabilities in general have a significantly lower rate of graduation than the average. Really, the intersection of these two areas is about having culturally and linguistically responsive special education systems and processes. So all parts of the special education process should be reviewed and considered for impacts on multilingual learners. For referrals, it is understanding that second language acquisition process versus indicators of disability, making sure that there is appropriate classroom instruction for all students, which again requires that personnel preparation and professional development. The evaluation requires those assessments that are free of cultural and racial bias and ideally in the home language. And the individualized education program, or IEP, should really seek to break the silos between these two areas, understand the whole child and their needs, and support both their needs under their disability and their language acquisition needs. And a key thing to understand for this intersection of multilingual learners and students with disabilities is eligibility for special education services. a lack of English proficiency cannot be the reason that a student is identified as having a disability, as well as a lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math, which is oftentimes something that impacts our refugee and immigrant students as well. So I'm going to close out with some common myths about multilingual learners and special education. One that we hear a lot is that special education supersedes English language services. There's more laws about special education, and that is not true. As you saw, there are laws and policies on both sides. There is also a very pervasive myth that you have to wait 2 years or 1 year or 3 years after a student arrives in the US before you can refer them to evaluation for special education. That is also not true. There is no minimum period, and it's very important that if a student has clear needs, that we're not making them wait an arbitrary amount of time to get those supports. And the last one is something that I hear a lot. I think from well-meaning educators want to get English learners the support that they need, and maybe don't feel equipped to do that in their classroom. And so they think that students will get more help in special education. There's smaller classes, so that's where they can get the support. But special education is for those specific categories laid out in IDEA, and does not necessarily mean that students will be in a smaller setting, and is not designed to support English language acquisition. And I see, it looks like I'm going to stop sharing. I know there were a couple things in the chat. And then Jeff, I know you wanted to share some calls to action.
Yeah, I want to ask a few questions because we've had the opportunity to go over a lot of some of these policy implications, especially around funding and appropriations, not just in IDEA, but education in general. And then one of the key things that Kuna finished with was about the decimation of the Office of Civil Rights. And then you brought back to that, Jill, the fact that really that is the office that oversees the enforcement and the adherence to the protection of civil rights for all learners, not just MLEs or those with disabilities or those that are duly identified, but for all learners. And you have a case right now where, as Kuna pointed out, what was it, 7 of 12 of the regional offices have been closed. The department put out one of those executive orders was about disparate impact, all focused on DEI and trying to deprioritize enforcement of civil rights. So if you're an educator or you're a parent and you're looking at this, what kind of recourse might you have? What would you have any recommendations for educators or for families that might be listening to this?
I'm happy to take a stab, which is that under IDEA there's due process, and there's a fully fleshed out kind of process for challenging a school and a district if your child is not if their rights have been violated, and in an ideal world that doesn't have to go too far to be remedied. In an ideal world, it doesn't happen in the first place. But I mean, you can go all the way up through the court system. We just saw a Supreme Court case involving a student with epilepsy that ruled in her favor last week, I believe, or I guess it was 2 weeks ago, but really recently. So the Office for Civil Rights is a really key oversight lever for if someone's rights have been violated, but it is not the only way that that those violations can be remedied or can be pursued. So
Thank you. And Kuna, I don't want to put you on the spot or commit you to anything, but if there's any resources you could share, we'd be happy to include those when we send out this recording, anything that would be appropriate there. And I did have another question. Kuna, I think you may have referenced it, Jill. I'm not sure if you did as well. But one of the things happening is at least as I understand it, the move by the Department of Ed to try to shift IDEA over to Health and Human Services out of the Department of Ed. What are some things that you see as maybe concerns or challenges ahead, and also to the same degree, do you see advocacy efforts to try to block that move?
So I'll go first, and then Jill, you go after. There are a lot of answers to that question. The first is, if you were to hypothetically dismantle a department, that doesn't mean that the laws that they oversee go away. And so you have to do a lot of kind of technical tweaking of those laws to put them in other agencies, which is one of the challenges, right? You can't just put IDEA back, as they're saying, in HHS. Now, the Department of Health and Human Services was a different agency before the establishment of the Department of Education. It had a different purview that did include education. So it's not that there wasn't a federal role, it just was at a different agency. From a kind of both symbolic and practical standpoint, CEC is really against, and I have not found an advocacy organization that is for moving IDEA programs to HHS for a wide variety of reasons. First being, like, kind of my knee-jerk reaction is that's resegregating a population that we've worked over the last 50 years to integrate into the general ed system, right? And if there are other, they are special education students are general education students first. So why would you silo them from the rest of K-12 education or early education or career and tech or what have you, right? It doesn't make kind of logical or ethical sense. The other is that HHS is a massive agency. And unless you move like all of the Department of Ed over to HHS, logistically, you're not going to be able to execute in the same way. There's the argument is to to provide the control back to give the reins back to states. But we have existing federal education laws, and they need to be funded and implemented. And that's the function of the Department of Education, is to do that, right? And so moving it doesn't take away those laws. It just changes the jurisdiction. I mean, I was joking with a Hill staffer the other day that maybe someone could just like paint HHS over the Department of Education building and then call it a day and let everyone continue to do their jobs, because they still have to do those jobs regardless of where it is. But it doesn't make a lot of logical sense. You can't really, quote unquote, return education to the states unless you dismantle the federal laws, I think. And that's a huge risk, because the IDEA, Title I, the grant programs that have specific purposes to serve specific populations, they were developed to react to specific needs, national needs, that weren't being taken care of, if you will, at the state level for whatever the reason, right? So they serve a function, and most of them serve an equity function. Jill, get off my soapbox and hand it over to you.
Yeah, and the silo is also what the first thing that came to my mind. We have spent so much time and continue to spend time trying to break the silos down between special ed and English language learner services, between gen ed and both services, knowing that kids with disabilities and English learners are gen ed kids. And so further siloing that is only going to make things worse and not improve anything. So it doesn't seem logical to kind of move backwards rather than forwards.
Well, I'd love to learn a little bit more about your efforts, and happy TESOL to come alongside if there's anything that we can do to help support in your advocacy efforts, especially to help maybe perhaps thwart is the good word, thwart that move, or at least the design to try to move it over there. We did have a question in the chat. Sandra asks, what are the options for multilingual learners to be served through Title I funding when they represent a portion of the district population? What are other states doing with ML programs? I don't know if that's necessarily something that either of you might have any comment on. I'm not a Title I expert, but as I understand it, just because you receive Title III funding as an English learner does not mean that you are excluded from the Title I benefits. So if that is happening, that is definitely well, that's wrong in that case. But I don't have, and Sanders is correct on that. So thank you. And Sandra, that might be something you would want to reach out. I'd be happy to talk with you about ways that we could, perhaps collect that information. There's always, I'm always happy to work with fellow advocates if we need information to help us understand what what is the landscape and what's going on, what people are doing, putting those together. So feel free to reach out. Be happy to talk on that. Okay. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour, and so I don't want to just move on unless there's some other burning questions. I don't know, Kuna and Jill, I'd like if you had any last comments before we talk about some calls to action that we can do. If there's anything else you'd like to highlight, or just kind of rewind a little bit and emphasize.
Sure, I'll go first. I'll just say, I think at the beginning of this year, when we started to hear kind of momentum for support behind closing the Department of Education, canceling grants, even the USAID kind of closure, whatever you want to call it. It occurred to me that in my professional life, I spend a lot of time advocating toward Congress, towards those key decision makers. But in my personal life, there's a real void in my advocacy work. I was surprised that a lot of my peers didn't understand what the Department of Education does, and realized that I silo my life in the way that I'm trying to de-silo, if you will, the programs that we support. And so I know Jeff is going to talk about some ways that we can reach out to key decision makers to kind of prevent bad proposals from going through, and hopefully get decisions to speed up in a positive way. But I just want to put in a plug that advocacy is more than sophisticated people knowing how to talk to legislators. It is really about talking about the value of your work all the time and making sure your peers know what you're doing and know what the impact is. Whether it doesn't have to be, a long drawn out kind of soapbox moment, but I think it's important for our family, our friends, our neighbors to know about the work that we do and the value that it holds. It doesn't have to be political, but advocacy is so much. It's so much. And when you don't talk about the value of your work, we've seen the real serious negative repercussions, right? We're in such a defensive mode right now about the programs that we really deeply care about and believe in. And hopefully with the spreading of more positive information kind of to the general public, as well as our decision makers, we can reverse that momentum.
Yeah.
Question came up. I'm sorry, Jill, go for it.
Oh, I was just gonna
I
say,
interrupted there.
building off of that, Sandra's question about what different states are doing made me think about, I work in the context of New York, where, there has been a lot of support that even if these changes come, that New York will continue to fund things, but that is unfortunately not the case everywhere. And so it's really important for all of us to be advocating, regardless of where you are and what you think will happen in your context, in order for us to support all kids and have that, that enforcement and accountability across the board.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you both for that. And Kuna, I love your I don't know if you would call it a metaphor, but just sharing with you that you realize that personal advocacy is so important. And then that statement you said, you don't have to be a policy expert to go to your member of Congress to make your voice heard. Just like we talked about at the beginning, it's right there in the Constitution. You've got the right to petition your government with your grievances, and one of the best ways to do that is go to your member of Congress. You got access, and not just at the federal level. Do it at the local, the state level as well. And one thing that I always find impactful, and I think it was back up in the chat that Sue, and my apologies, I can't remember. I don't know if Sue is still on, but she shared about a story about her daughter, an English learner and also special needs. And so it was, I think, I want to connect with that because that story is powerful in the hands of congressional members. To give you an example, and I think, Kuna, you're probably well aware of this, is that Susan Collins up in Maine, a Republican, is pushing back hard on the Department of Ed wanting to get rid of TRIO grants, for pathways into higher education because of a story of her constituent. It's not just about the numbers and how many people. It is a real life story. This has direct impact to the people I serve. So taking your story to Congress is just invaluable in that process. And I will share. Let me see, get this up here real quick. If you would like to take some action, we've got a couple of links, and I'll also put these links in the chat for you. The first one is something that you could do right now. Going back to the beginning, we talked about fiscal year 25. There's still some unallocated programs from the Department of Ed. We've highlighted the IELCE, the Integrated English Language and Civics Education from Adult Education, and Title III, English Language Acquisition, out of the Every Student Succeeds Act. These two have not been allocated to states right now. And the best thing you can do, tying into stories, is if you are in one of these programs that are funded, what is the impact if you don't have that that funding? What's the impact to your state? What's the impact to your local education agency, your adult ed program? Share that story with that. So there's a link there. That's the first one. TESOL sent a joint letter to what's called the four corners of the authorization committees and the appropriation committees. Basically that same point. So we joined with 20 other organizations specifically focused on Title III funding. Go to Congress. I mean, excuse me, not go to Congress. We are asking Congress to go to the Department of Ed and demand that this be released. Just yesterday had opportunity to meet with the Department of Ed, and they only said one congressional member's even asked about Title III and why it hasn't, and that to me is, we have been advocating and putting in front of Congress. We need Congress to make those inquiries and hold them accountable in that. And then Kuna referenced the comments that we put to Federal Register on the Secretary's priorities for education. We also have in those comments, you will see that we do have some comment too on the intersection, as Jill was pointing out, between MLEs and those with disabilities. And then lastly, I wanted to make sure we put up Kuna's, the Council for Exceptional Children. They have an advocacy site as well. Their advocacy calls to action are there, specific to their association, and it's one thing I think that we TESOL and CEC and other organizations, we have our advocacy efforts, but we also like to join together in these. We do that often, and so we'll be looking for ways that we can partner together in that. So I do, leave that up there, put that in the chat for you. Please feel free to take action, make your voice heard in this process. So I will go ahead and just move on. I want to get to the very last slide here. This is, of course, TESOL. We would love for you to join TESOL. I'll send this in the PowerPoint slides out, but we do have some activities up. We do have AI in the classroom workshop. These are just the advertisement my marketing says I got to put up here. So I'm putting them up there, but you'll see them again in the PowerPoint slide. And lastly, we do have our virtual convention coming up in November, and as well as a pre-K through 12 day right thereafter. And then I think this is the most important. Advocacy does not happen without you. So I wanted to say thank you to all of you. Thank you for showing up today. Thank you especially for those who will leave here today. And maybe you will take action at the federal level. Maybe you'll get more involved at the local level with your districts, whatever, at your state level. But whatever advocacy you do, thank you especially for taking that step to be an advocate. So with that, well, there was another new message. With any more questions, I just thank you. I love the thank yous. So they're always fun to receive there. So with that, we'll give you back the rest of your evening, and probably in the next 2 or 3 days, we'll send the recording and any resources out to all of the registrants. And a special thank you to Kuna and Jill for sharing with us today. Thank you all.
Thank you.